In medieval Europe, winter wasn't the chilly, picturesque season we imagine today. It was a warning, a line drawn sharply between those who still possessed survival skills and those who wouldn't live to see spring. With no electricity, no medical system, no stocked supermarkets, every family depended entirely on knowledge passed down through generations. A single mistake, harvesting on the wrong day, lighting the fire an hour too late, could be the difference between life and death. What modern people struggle to accept is how our ancestors viewed winter itself, not as weather, but as a predator, silent and patient, always waiting just behind them. When the wind shifted direction, when the silence thickened like something watching, when food stores thinned to their final handfuls, survival depended on whether they remembered and applied the right technique at the right moment. Skills like reading storm signs in the sky, identifying edible forest plants, processing meat in freezing conditions, or keeping a flame alive even when the wind fought against them. None of these were tips. They were survival formulas written in the lessons of loss. And here's the most uncomfortable truth. Even with all our modern comforts, many of those medieval techniques would still save lives today if everything suddenly collapsed. If this sparks something in you, curiosity, awe, or even questions, share your thoughts. That curiosity is exactly what helps us understand the price our ancestors paid just to make sure the next generation survived. During the famine of 1315, when the very last grain kernel vanished from the storeroom and livestock collapsed on the frozen stable floor, medieval families were forced to look for life in a place modern people wouldn't even consider: the thin cambium layer between the bark and the wood. Bark bread wasn't a rustic tradition. It was a desperate decision, passed down from winters when entire villages had only two choices left: adapt or starve. Finding the right tree at the right moment required knowledge only families who had survived for generations possessed. Pine resin flowed heavily in early spring, softening the inner bark and boosting its nutrients. Birch offered a faint sweetness. Old trees, or any tree leaking white sap, had to be avoided at all costs. The toxins could kill a household in a single meal. Even the harvesting process was brutal. They carved long vertical lines down the trunk, carefully spaced, never circling the tree, because one wrong cut could strangle next year's only food source. The cambium was peeled away with bone or wood tools, dried on hot stones until crisp, then crushed with a quern stone into a resin-flavored powder, coarse, bitter, hard to swallow, yet enough to keep a family alive. Mixed at a ratio of 1 part bark flour to 3 parts grain, it became a dark, bitter loaf that tasted like desperation, but kept people breathing through months when not a single green shoot could be found. So let me ask you this: when hunger shakes your hands so hard you can't hold a knife, do you think you could force yourself to swallow that bread? What most modern people can't even picture is this: making bark bread was never just peel the tree and grind what you get. It was a harsh, back-breaking chain of tasks that swallowed hours, sometimes entire days. And every step carried the risk of losing the only food your family had for the week. Once that precious cambium layer was peeled away, medieval families faced the hardest part: turning it into flour. The strips were spread across large stones set beside the fire, and someone had to rotate them constantly so they wouldn't scorch. One moment of distraction, one cough, one gust of smoke stinging the eyes, and an entire half-day's harvest could turn into a pile of useless black ash. And only when the cambium cracked like brittle shards of bark did the real ordeal begin. They used quernstones, 2 heavy slabs of rock rotated by hand. One person pushed, one stabilized, and their arms went numb after thousands of rotations, all for just a handful of coarse powder that smelled of sap and tasted of dirt. Even more shocking, some records suggest that during the worst famines, children as young as 6 or 7 were put on the quern. If they tired and slowed down, the flour stayed too coarse, the bread baked unevenly, and the family could fall short on food before the week was over. But here's the twist. Despite its bitterness, its resin taste, and its reputation as the last resort, bark flour is the very reason many villages survived the darkest winters, and why Europe managed to crawl through a famine that lasted years. If you were living through that, do you think you'd have the patience to repeat this grueling ritual every single day? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective might open a new window for someone else. In medieval life, rope wasn't a convenient tool. It was the backbone of survival itself. Without rope, you couldn't keep a roof on during a storm, couldn't secure livestock when floods came down the valley, couldn't set traps, haul supplies, or save someone who slipped on the ice. A single snapped cord in winter could turn an ordinary day into a disaster. A family crossing a wooden bridge, one tiny crack, and the frozen river beneath would swallow everyone before they could even scream. That's why medieval people could walk into any field or forest edge, and after just a few hours, walk back out carrying dozens of feet of rope as strong as animal sinew. Nettles were harvested at the end of summer when their fibers reached peak toughness. Willow bark was stripped in early spring while still soft, then twisted while wet so it would dry into something stiff as iron. And in desperate moments, even human hair, braided layer by layer with the right technique, could lift dozens of kilos, strong enough to pull supplies over a fortress wall during a siege. At the heart of rope, memory was the counter-twist method. Twist each fiber in one direction, then braid the entire strand in the opposite. The harder the pull, the tighter the rope locked into itself, creating a cord so strong that modern people can hardly believe it was made with bare hands. And here's the frightening truth. If you couldn't make rope, you didn't just lose a tool, you lost your ability to keep yourself alive. If you were dropped into the medieval world, do you think you'd survive your first winter without knowing how to twist a single strand? Let's hear your answer. In years of crop failure, when the fields turned useless and the granaries sat hollow and echoing, medieval people had to rely on a skill modern humans have almost completely lost. Reading food in the forest and underwater the way you read a book you've memorized. To them, the forest wasn't a threat. It was a breathing pantry, as long as you understood its language. They knew the exact week when each spring shoot held its highest nutrition, which roots needed to be boiled 3 times to purge their toxins, which seeds could last an entire winter if roasted just right. One wrong choice, especially in a famine, didn't just poison the eater. It could take away the only working hands a family had left. The water told its own story. With no metal hooks or modern nets, they carved hooks out of bone, thorns, or fire-softened wood bent carefully by hand. Their fish traps, fences woven from branches, worked through the night, guiding fish into narrowing channels they couldn't escape, providing steady protein for entire villages. And the most astonishing part? None of this knowledge was instinctive. It was a collective memory, built from generations of dangerous trial and error. In a world where mistaking one mushroom could cost an entire family their lives, the ability to see food in a wild, indifferent landscape was the line between the people who survived and the ones winter erased. In those medieval winters, so long that even the elders couldn't remember the last morning without fog, stepping into the forest was never a confident act. It was a fragile negotiation between humans and nature, one where the harsh environment punished every mistake instantly. Medieval people understood the forest had two faces: by day, a hidden pantry; by night, a living presence watching every step of the desperate. They carried a constant fear of being hunted by the weather itself, because losing sight of the sun or misreading a shift in the wind could mean never finding the path home, freezing to death beneath branches turning to stone. Foraging back then wasn't picking a few edible leaves. It was a life or death exam. Choose the wrong route and you'd collapse within 6 hours. Misidentify one mushroom and your body would go numb before you could call anyone's name. Fail to catch fish on the last afternoon before the lake froze over, and the entire household would face the night without enough calories to stay warm. The people who survived were the ones who could read the forest the way you read the mood of an animal, listening to the subtle change in water sounds under the ice to find fish, noticing squirrel bite marks on pine cones to locate seed-rich trees, smelling the soil shift before a storm to decide whether to push deeper or turn back before the forest locked its doors. In a world like that, the real question wasn't, what can we eat? But what can we take without awakening the forest's cruel side? If you were placed in that winter, would you dare walk into the woods armed with nothing but a handful of inherited skills? Share your thoughts. Sometimes a modern viewpoint reveals just how much instinct we've lost since our ancestors fought to stay alive. In the medieval world, where there were no shops, no surplus iron, and absolutely no concept of backup supplies, making a tool wasn't just a skill. It was the one miracle standing between humans and extinction. People didn't walk into the forest to gather wood. They stepped in, seeing hundreds of materials waiting to be awakened. A single stone that could become a blade, a discarded animal bone that could turn into a needle, a fishing hook, or a chisel tip, a rotting tree trunk that could provide a tool handle, stronger than most factory-cut lumber today. But here's what most modern people never realize. Every tool began with fear, because if you couldn't craft what you needed in time, you and your family might not survive the winter. The true high-stakes moment was stone knife making. Finding a rock with the right internal fracture was already hard. Striking it at the perfect angle without shattering the entire core was even harder. Miss one blow, just one, and you lost an entire day of work, forced to start again as the sky darkened, the wind picked up, and the fire in your shelter began to die. When the blade finally took shape, they hafted it by pressing it into a split wooden handle, wrapping the join with dried sinew. Once that sinew dried, it tightened like steel, creating a bond strong enough to slice frozen meat, split bone, or chip firewood buried under ice. The shocker? Many medieval tools, when made correctly, performed better than early metal tools. Precision, not material, was what decided survival. If you had to craft every tool you owned using nothing but the natural world, where do you think you'd start? Share your thoughts. Your answer might reveal an instinct you never realized you still had. In the depths of a medieval winter, Staying warm wasn't about blankets or comfort. It was a silent war against an invisible enemy, slipping through every crack in the wood. Medieval families knew that if the fire died at 3 in the morning, the entire household might never wake again. If they dug a shelter in the wrong corner of a slope, the next snowstorm could turn that refuge into an ice grave, sealing every hope inside. With darkness stretching 16 hours a day, checking every layer of the roof and every grain of wood became a survival ritual, because missing even one draft gap could let in a stream of cold, strong enough to kill an elderly person in a single night. Everything started with fire making. Fat wood had to be chosen from the right spot. Pick a rotten piece by mistake, and you'd lose your only chance to keep flames alive when the season's first storm rolled in. Without modern insulating clothes, they relied on natural layering. Fur for heat, dry straw to block the wind, and an outer layer of plant fibers that let moisture escape without draining body warmth. But it was the psychological horror that kept people awake. The wind slamming the walls like something was trying to force its way in. The subtle tremor of roof beams, warning that the bindings were about to snap. The fire's crackle fading into a thin whisper that made everyone sit up and check. In that world, survival didn't belong to the warmest. It belonged to the ones who made no mistakes. If you were dropped into the coldest night of a medieval winter, what do you think would keep you awake? The cold itself, or the fear of the fire going out? Share your thoughts below. In medieval life, ash wasn't waste. It was strategic capital, almost a form of political power within every household. Whoever mastered ash, knowing which wood produced strong lye, which was safe for food, which could treat wounds, essentially controlled the hygiene, medicine, and even the status of their community. But beneath that miracle lay a dark truth. They were doing dangerous chemistry with bare hands in a world that had no concept of safety. Just one wrong drop of lye and the caustic solution could eat through skin instantly. If the ash came from the wrong wood, soap turned into poison. If a child confused grapevine ash with oak ash, they could suffer permanent eye damage. And yet in many medieval families, children as young as 8 were tasked with reading ash by its color and scent, an ability we'd call insane today. But back then, it was mandatory for survival. Oak ash produced lye so strong that just a few drops in water could strip grease from anything, while beech ash made a gentler solution used to treat food and neutralize the sourness of preserved goods. Grapevine ash was so valuable that some villages traded it like salt. It cleaned teeth better than most herbs. Medieval households stirred lye in wooden barrels, dropping in an egg to test its strength. If the egg rose too quickly, they knew the solution could burn skin in just a few breaths. Behind every bar of soap, every cleaned wound, every disinfected tool was a chain of risky decisions. If you lived in that world, would you dare stir a solution capable of burning your whole hand? Go ahead, share what you think.